So last week we touched on the 1600s and that moment when England was establishing colonies in the Western Hemisphere and what was going on in English thought at the time and how that got kind of transferred to the English Puritans who came to especially New England, especially the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Today I'd like to try to better understand how the rhetoric of this small group of Christian Puritans in the 1630s and following became a national rhetoric. And that's a complicated story that it's taken me a long time to try to, I had a sense that it happened, but how it kind of happened is a kind of a involved story. But we'll try to hit on a couple of high points with that. Then next week I thought it would be interesting to go to one of the great moments of challenge about this whole notion of whether or not the nation was founded as a Christian nation. And that is the debate over slavery and the end of slavery and what happened kind of after the Civil War. And this is also a key moment where a white racial identity really comes into the conversation. As the Northerners, whites in the North and whites in the South, kind of try to find a way to reconcile after the Civil War. And then in our last session, we'll try to come up to the present moment and talk a little bit about the forms that Christian nationalism has taken in the last, it seems like it has emerged rather quickly, but really probably in the last decade, where it's kind of come back into some prominence. But as a teacher, I can't resist a little bit of review. And so the Puritans of New England, who came in 1630, the first large group came in 1630, developed an understanding of themselves as having a covenant with God for the work they were engaged in. That work was a complicated kind of amalgam of being a witness to England of what it would be like to have a kind of a society where religious and state authority were wedded together. It was also at times, although they were never consistent with this, also at times a sense of we have missionary work to do among indigenous people to try to convert Indians to Christian faith. But they also had this sense of like we're not always living up to what we don't always practice what we say we want to believe or what we believe. And so a scholar looked at what are called Puritan election day sermons, and he found a rhetorical structure that was incredibly powerful, and that he called the Jeremiad. And the Jeremiad started with, and he found these in printed sermons by Puritan ministers in the 1630s, 40s, 50s, all out throughout the 17th century. A statement of promise. We are a chosen people set aside by God for a special purpose, a special function. A statement of declension, a falling away, that we are not living as though we are that people of promise. Okay. But then the scholar Saka von Berkovich found that rather than challenging the promise, maybe we're not the children of God we thought we were, it was followed by a prophecy that if we take care of this declension, if we address the points of sin, the points of falling away, then we will be the people we were meant to be. So he calls this rhetorical structure a liminal rhetorical structure because in its beginning, you find its ending. The statement of promise is so strong that any declension can be interpreted as a testing, as a temporary problem. Okay. That if it's addressed, then we will become the people of God we were meant to be. Okay. The reason I want to come back to this is because this is a rhetorical pattern that I think is one of the places where the Puritans have a great deal of influence on American culture as it later develops. Because you can see this rhetorical pattern played out in various moments of American history. And next week we can talk about the abolitionist movement, because you certainly see it there. We were meant to be a democratic nation founded on liberty. We have allowed slavery to exist in our midst. If we get rid of slavery, then we'll be the nation of liberty we were meant to be. So the statement of the promise can change, but the promise is so strong that it's never really fully questioned.
We spoke about that last week, and you were mentioning that question, the response, was itself fundamentally inadequate because it didn't address the fundamentals of racism. It addressed the superficial response in the form of slavery.
Yeah, that's one scholar I was reading who really pointed out a really fascinating point, that the declension among the abolitionists, the declension is not racism, the declension is slavery. And he makes that point because after the Civil War, the place of African Americans is really not settled in American culture. Because there are very few, even among the radical abolitionists, there are very few who see African Americans as fully capable of being their fellow citizens in this Republic of Promise. So we'll talk about that. We can talk about that more next week. And the other thing that I wanted to really stress is this notion of providentialism, is the belief that God works in history and lifts certain nations up to do his will, to assist in God's salvation history. At one level, there's a providentialism that says God will judge nations on how faithful they are to God's teachings. But on another level, there's this, what one scholar calls historical providentialism, which argues that God has raised up a people, a nation, and has a special relationship with that nation in order to accomplish something in history. That's where I'd like to start this morning, because I'd like to deal with two issues. What's going on in British or English providential thought in the 17th century, and then what it's like at the decades of the Revolution, 1760s and 70s, how this rhetoric of the Puritans gets adopted by national voices, by national leadership. Okay. The first is, if you're English, the 17th century, it becomes a fairly hard century to continuously claim that God is on your side. Okay? Because the evidence of God being on your side is kind of national flourishing. Okay. Well, in the 17th century, they execute Charles I, and there's a Puritan kind of commonwealth for a time, and then they go back to the monarchy. So, well, what was God on our side when we executed Charles, or was God on our side when we reinstituted the monarchy? Which one was God? And so that sense of like, it would be easier to claim God is on your side if there is a continual evidence of God's blessing. But this up and down stuff makes it kind of tough for the English who believe in historical providentialism to really make their claim. To really claim that God's on our side, God's richly blessed us, we have a special purpose to play in history. Easy to say when it's like, look, because we just defeated the Spanish Armada, so God must be on our side because our Navy just defeated the greatest Navy on the planet. Okay. But then they rebel against the monarchy, and the Commonwealth doesn't go well, they reinstitute. So can you see why that would be hard for the English to maintain that sense of unbroken blessing from God? But what if, and this is the kind of thing that with this rhetoric kind of never like fades away because it's so adaptable. So the rhetoric is, what if God's blessing on the English is not through the English in England, what if the blessing is through our colonies? What if God's miraculous work to be done through us is not going to be done here in England, but it's going to be done in the colonies? Okay. So there's a shift among some theorists of providential thought. It's like, oh no, that's okay that things are kind of rocky here in England because God is shifting his blessings to our colonies. Okay. So that's the first step. It's like maybe God's blessing isn't for us here, maybe it's going to be through the colonies. Of course, we get to the 18th century and those colonies rebel, right? That becomes a little hard again for the English to maintain that we're being blessed. But then the shift, that's where this key shift comes. Maybe it's not England that is this blessed people. Maybe it's America. Maybe it's this emerging United States. Again, not hard to make that argument if you're thinking about that God's providence, we see evidence of God's providence in God's blessing. Because look at the size of England, the natural resources of England, and then as they start to understand the size of the North American continent and the natural resources of the North American continent, like, oh my goodness, this is like so vast that this perhaps is evidence of God's blessing. Okay. Because without Scotland and Ireland and Wales, England, I think, is roughly the size of Idaho. Okay, can you imagine that? Size of Idaho with London kind of sitting there. This is like massive, right? But it's like, so can you imagine what it would have been like for those English folks to land on the North American continent and start to experience the vast, even the forests of New England would have been stunning to them, considering how much lumber has been harvested in England over the years. So there was a law at one point in New England that if you cut down trees that were too big, you couldn't use them in your houses. They needed to go back to England for shipbuilding because those would be the mast used in English sailing vessels. So if you go, even today I'm told that if you go to certain old 17th century houses in New England, you'll see these long beams that were kind of hidden. Like we put it in our house, but we kind of camouflage it so that the officials don't see that we're using lumber that technically probably should go back to England. We're using it in our house. So the shift comes like, maybe it's not in England where the blessings will be seen. Maybe it's New England where the blessings will be seen. So that sense, they don't surrender that sense of historical providentialism, that God has a special purpose for the English. They just shift it to Anglo-Americans, who then start to kind of adopting that rhetoric themselves.
Haven't you made a case then that the people who were in fact actually fleeing England, the Pilgrims and the Puritans were essentially the outcasts, and how was it that the primary English back in England were looking at things, had nothing to do with religion, but had everything to do with commerce. They were just basically greedy.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think, this is why I think it's interesting, Stan. The Pilgrims are certainly seen as outcasts. Right. The Puritans, not so much. The Puritans are much more well established in English society. They're almost seen as the avant-garde, the leading edge of true English, of the true destiny of England.
And so they're the ones who are finally going to clean up the things that have been a mess,
yes,
and be okay. And so we're going to invest our ethics, in them. Yeah. And oh, by the way, they also happen to have a grand, huge country that can send us logs and stuff.
Right, and so they're both religiously avant-garde. They're on the cutting edge religiously because they have established a society where civil and religious authority are more unified, and they're also very prosperous because the Massachusetts Bay Company is doing quite well in the 17th century. Now, again, all of this, I'm focusing on New England because that's where this rhetoric kind of develops. But remember, there are other colonies doing their thing as well. But it's not as present in the Virginia colony. This rhetoric isn't as, because they're Anglicans, they're not kind of invested in this kind of like we're the cutting edge. It's like, no, we're trying to be good Anglicans, and happen to be doing quite well, again, because of the enslaved labor that we're using to harvest tobacco and eventually cotton. Okay. So that shift to maybe the promise is in New England. Maybe the promise is through our colonies, not here in England. Okay. So that's what's kind of going on in English providential thought. But when we come to the 1750s, 60s, and 70s, something else starts taking place among these North American colonies that the British have established. And that is really, really unhappy with Parliament. Okay, really unhappy with Parliament. Because, and from Parliament's perspective, it's like, wait a minute, we helped support you during what became known as the French and Indian Wars. You survived that because our military was there helping you. We think you should pay for that with higher taxes. And the colonists were saying, particularly in Massachusetts, say, wait a minute, we don't have representation in Parliament. So you can't tax us when we don't have anybody there representing us. Okay.
When did that idea begin?
Oh my!
In England. It's about having to be represented, whether it was by the common people or by the lords.
Yeah, the House of Commons, House of Lords, that parliamentary system goes way back, but it really does kind of take root. I'm not sure of the exact dates, but it is 17th century where this really gets well established that we don't. The Crown will not simply impose tax. The Crown will work through Parliament. So this comes after the reestablishment of the monarchy. It's reestablished with an understanding that it's a parliamentary monarchy. Okay, that the king or queen is not just going to do whatever they want. They're going to work through Parliament. Therefore, representation in Parliament matters. Okay. And the colonists are arguing, we're not represented in Parliament. We're used to, and this is still just a great idea to me, that this is what happened throughout Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Bay Colony, that they would have town meetings where everybody gathered up, and whatever council they had proposed the taxes for the year, and they all voted whether that was an appropriate tax or not. And the majority said, if they had the majority, it's like, okay, that's the tax rate for the next year, because there were 300 of us at the meeting, and 175 said yes, and 125 maybe said no, majority has it, there we are. That's how they're used to determining taxation. Okay.
They still have town meetings.
Yeah, but I'm not sure the annual budget is always there. But okay, so this is really, they're really used to self-government. And here comes Parliament, kind of like, okay, kind of imposing their ideas on them.
How big was the British Empire at this time?
Oh my gosh, it's huge. There's the 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard, but there's also colonies, much more prosperous colonies, in the Caribbean. I mean, in terms of money, the money being generated in the Caribbean because of enslaved labor is much, those are the lucrative colonies.
Do they have India at that time?
No. I don't think that India is much, I think India is later, yeah. But in fact, there's some historians of the Revolution who argue that one of the reasons that the British finally say, we got to quit fighting this war in North America is because we need to focus our attention on making sure we hold our colonies in the Caribbean. This will be a blow to our pride to lose the 13 colonies, but it'll be a real blow to our pocketbook if we lose the Caribbean. And if France gets a sense that they're really distracted by the North American colonies, they won't pay it, that whole thing kind of mixes in. Make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, now, so So when we come to the way that the colonists are thinking, first of all, okay, it's one thing to rebel against Parliament. Okay. When Jefferson is asked to write a draft of the Declaration, the draft of the Declaration he brings back to first his little committee that he's working with and then to the Continental Congress doesn't just go after Parliament, it goes after King George. And this is a more serious thing because what do they believe about monarchs? God-given. This is God's emissary on earth. And we're going to criticize King George? Like, wow, how do you do that? Interesting, here's a sidelight. 1730s and 40s, there's a series of revivals that sweep through the colonies that comes to be known as the Great Awakening. And in that Great Awakening, George Whitefield, who's a friend of the Wesleys, is the great preacher of the Great Awakening in the colonies. It really changes the understanding of Christian faith. It really disrupts that double predestination that they had inherited from the Calvinists and really comes to a point of like, no, you decide. You decide whether or not you're going to be a disciple. Okay. And so that there are some historians who have argued that it was that redefining the person's relationship with God is one of the things that allows them to redefine the person's relationship with the monarch. Okay. And so that's a part of all of this as well. Okay. But, so now let's think about the rhetoric that develops among the rebels. Okay. Part of it is like, we're not being anti-English in our revolution. We're being English. In fact, we're being more English than the English are being. Because we believe deeply that you cannot tax people who are not represented. And that's an English idea. We didn't come up with that. That's an old idea that we brought with us from England. So in that sense, it's like, no, we're not rebelling because we're rejecting England. We're rebelling because we're good English subjects. And we think we're being mistreated. We didn't stop being English when we crossed the Atlantic. We didn't stop being subjects of the monarch and parliament when we crossed the Atlantic. We're English. We're just English who believe profoundly in liberty. Okay, now you start looking back. Where else have you found English folks who believe profoundly in liberty? Pilgrims in 1620, the Puritans in 1630. Okay. So now these 18th century English rebels can look back and say, we've got this unbroken chain of English subjects seeking liberty. Okay. So there's a continuity, like we're in line with the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Okay. Once that rhetoric starts developing, easy to say then that, and just like the Pilgrims and Puritans, we've been blessed by God. We've been set aside by God for a specific purpose, and we're trying to live out that purpose. Okay. This is, again, the rhetoric is much stronger in New England, in the New England colonies, in Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, Connecticut, than it is, let's say, in the Carolinas and in Virginia. But it starts kind of moving its way through the colonies. That sense of like, and if you want evidence of unbroken blessing, look how far we've come from the Puritans, from the Pilgrims, and let's stay with the Pilgrims, because I think this is where the Pilgrims really emerge, even though they're a very, very small group. The Pilgrims who survived that first winter, who had to leave England because their freedom of worship was being constrained, we're like them. interestingly, we're not like them because we're needing religious liberty. Religious liberty is simply not an issue for the revolutionary generation. That's been established. They've established religious liberty in all of the colonies. What they haven't established is this kind of right to self-government. And so when they look back and say, here's England has had this ups and downs in the 1600s. Here's their colonies in North America. It's not really true. Who can at least make an argument that's like, we've had continual success, continual growth. That's so not true. There are some really rough moments in the 17th and 18th century in the colonies. But it's easier to make the argument in New England and in the colonies than it is in England. So that shifting rhetoric that maybe England's promise is being lived out not in England but in the colonies, and therefore maybe all the colonies have a special relationship with God. Not in the language of John Winthrop's model of Christian charity to be a society bound together by the ligaments of love, but to embrace liberty, self-determination, freedom. And so that promise gets reworked. I think we could say in some ways secularized. I mean, in other words, the language is much less specifically Christian, but it's just as strong, the promise is just as strong. Okay. We were meant to be a nation founded in liberty. England will not allow us to be self-determining. If we defeat England in war, then we'll be the people we were meant to be. Okay. Do you see how that dynamic works? So this is why I think that Reverend Fannestill, in his opening remarks at the panel discussion we had a few weeks ago, said it's simply not a helpful question to ask, was America founded as a Christian nation? Because it's the kind of thing that pushes either a yes or no answer. When the more helpful question is, what role did religion play in the founding of the nation? Okay. Well, one of the roles that religion played, I would suggest, is a borrowing of the rhetoric of blessing, of covenant with God, secularized but powerful. So whether you want to look back at the founding of the nation to the Pilgrims and Puritans, or whether you want to look to the generation of the Revolution in the 18th century, we see this very strong sense that America is a place particularly blessed by God, and therefore, and also in a covenant relationship with God to achieve certain things in history related to God's saving work among the people, among all people. That's a lot of stuff. Questions, comments, points of clarification? Stan?
Do you think then that the idea of being able to self-govern, revolution, was fundamentally aligning themselves with a covenantal discussion among themselves that then had to be realized in the form of developing the Constitution, which is where the real founding, figuring out of the country had to have occurred. Not in the saying, we don't like this, but rather, we want something else.
Yeah, I think, again, I just find it really so interesting that we make such a big deal of the anniversaries of 1776 and almost nothing of the anniversaries of 1789, which is really, that's the start of the nation is when we ratify a constitution and elect a Congress and a president. the Declaration is just this moment of saying, we're not happy about this. We're so unhappy about this that we're willing to go to war. And by the way, the colonists are not all on board with that idea. Like, are you crazy? It's like, we're not going to go to war.
Establishing the idea, not in the Catholic Church liturgy, but our liturgy of justifiable war.
Well, I think that because you're defending your homeland, because you're a sense of like, there's definitely that going on, because part of the objection is that King George has brought English troops into the colonies, and they are occupying towns and occupying houses in Boston, and this is just unprecedented, uncalled for. He would never do this to England, to the English people living in England. So why should he be doing it here, right? So there is that sense of like, and the other thing that I found in Ken Burns' recent documentary and reading about the Revolution, the colonists don't have to win the war; they just have to survive long enough for England to abandon the war. I mean, this is always the situation of a war, a kind of a guerrilla war. And so Washington loses so many battles. Washington's army loses so many battles. Doesn't matter, retreat, fight again, and wait for England to get tired of this. Okay. And you really see that throughout this dynamic. So I think that, yes, it's justifiable because we're fighting for freedom, we're fighting for liberty, we're fighting for self-determination.
Yeah, I was going to, now the French, of course, in 1789, produce liberty, equality, and fraternity as the issues. And that seems to be the issues throughout, the political things throughout. So how far does equality go in the and I'm sure liberty, is liberty from England and so forth. But what about fraternity? I mean,
yeah.
Those people come together.
Bringing the question to the French Revolution, which for many of the founders in this country feel like we're all for liberty, but they're crazy. That's crazy. They're beheading people. We're not that. And I think in some ways it's a pulling back, especially because that rhetoric is especially prominent among the Virginia planters who are slave owners. And so this whole notion of like equality is like, we're happier with the language of the Constitution than we are with the language of the Declaration. It's also interesting, of course, that very little chance that the colonists win the war without the help of France. Catholic France, right, that kind of gets shoved like down, that gets a little pushed down a little bit, because part of the promise of the English colonies is that we're going to bring the true gospel, not the Catholic Church's version of the gospel, but the true gospel to the indigenous people. Okay, and so there is this really odd thing, but yeah, it is the equality piece of that French construction that's like, we're not quite sure about that. Again, the founders are across the board on this. Most of them do not believe in that level of equality. They believe in a kind of a natural aristocracy, and they really expect that their fellow citizens after the revolution are going to look to them and say, well, we know we're all equal, but you have leadership qualities that we want. And it's like, you should recognize I have leadership qualities. Why aren't you seeing that?
Well, my concept from the Constitution is that white males should not be able to vote because everybody else is given specific permission to vote. Women are given specific permission, black people are given specific. The only people that are specifically mentioned are white males.
And we all know the reason for that. At least we white males do. Like, some things are just obvious. But there is that strong sense in the Enlightenment thought that we're not sure that the Enlightenment is universal. That we're much more confident that white men of a certain social standing can be governed by their reason. They can be governed by their reason. We're not sure whether women and people of color can be governed by their reason. In fact, we're pretty sure they can't. is kind of the position that the founders kind of took. So in all of this, like, where does God's blessing kind of come into this notion that, well, would we have been able to defeat England in war if God had not been on our side? If you just look at London, I believe London at the time of the Revolution is over 1 million people in population. The largest city in the colonies, not Boston, Philadelphia. The population of Philadelphia at the time of the Revolution, about 40,000. Boston, 25,000. New York, 15,000. That's like, how in the world, people reading the London Times during the 1770s must have just like, how in the world are we losing this war? This is crazy. There's no way. So if you flip that from a colonial perspective, the question has to be, would we have been successful in staging this revolution if God were not on our side? Okay. And that has certainly governed a lot of the writing of history since that revolutionary generation. Okay. Now, to what extent depends largely on the writer's commitment to historical providentialism. But I've read people, there's especially a series of American history books, I use that term very loosely, that were very, very popular among the homeschool movement. In the first edition of The Light and the Glory came out in the 70s, the 1970s, and it remained incredibly popular. And in their narrative is like, God sent a fog bank to protect the Continental Army. And once Washington crossed this river, God sent a fog bank to keep the British from following them. I mean, that level of historical providentialism, that God intervened through the natural world to protect the Revolutionary Army.
Wow.
Okay. So that has been part of the legacy that has kind of come down to us. Again, I'm even as I'm talking about this stuff, I'm realizing that how much I'm talking about the Massachusetts Bay Colony when there are 12 other colonies. Okay, and I know much more about Massachusetts Bay than I do about the other colonies, in part because I've taught American literature and came to this material primarily in preparation to teach American literature, and New England was definitely the literary kind of center of American culture early on.
Is that because of publishing?
It's the publishing industry that takes root, but Boston overtakes Philadelphia pretty quickly in the publishing industry, and it's also because of Harvard as this kind of like, this is the place to go to school. It's also because New England is more committed to public education than other regions. And so if you're going to be a school teacher, you're probably going to be trained in Massachusetts Bay, especially in the years the decades right after the Revolution. Chances are, if you're teaching school in Connecticut, you went to school in Massachusetts. Okay. So they're like sending curriculum, sending teachers out, much more committed to public education for obvious reasons than Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia. Okay. When South Carolina at the time of the Revolution, 40% of the population is enslaved Africans. You're not committed to public education. So part of this is that this becomes part of the public education that American children learn about the founding of their own country. And it's definitely that God raised us up, God blessed us. That's why we were successful. That's why we've had the success we've had, is because of God's blessings.
And that becomes mythology that
Right.
comes down to now.
Yeah. And I think this is one reason why this has been such a persistent and recurring issue for Christians in America, is because we have what one historian called America a nation with the soul of a church, a nation that thinks of itself as in this particular sacred role of promoting God's saving work in history. Which is why, for me then, when I came to Richard John Newhouse, a Catholic writer, who offered me a definition of sacred and secular that I found really helpful. That he said sacred has to do with God's saving work in history, and all things related to God's saving work in history. Secular is things that are good for the time being, things that are in place for the time being. That helped me because I'd kind of been raised with the idea that sacred's good, secular's bad. And Newhouse like, well, no, secular just means for the present moment. Could be good, could be not so good. But it has nothing to do with God's saving, redemptive work in history. It's secular. My go-to example is democracy. Okay, I love democracy. I wish more of my fellow citizens believed in it at the current moment. I think we could use a lot more of it. Why we put up with some things as a society. Can I get on the soapbox for just a minute? You know, that's like estimates now are like something close to 45% of Americans identify as independent, politically independent, of American voters. 45%. Why we allow our two major political parties to have such control over elections, drawing maps, deciding who's on the ballot, closed primaries, that's just not democratic. I don't mean democratic like Democratic Party. That's just not like one person, one vote democratic. Okay. So democracy, I think it's a good thing, but I think it's a secular thing. In other words, I don't think it has a place in the coming kingdom of God. Jesus, we're not going to vote every 4 years to think, do we still want Jesus do we still want Jesus on the throne? Is that, are we gonna, like, what are we thinking here? No, it's a secular thing. It's for the time being. It's not part of God's sacred work in history. Although Sarah Amos's conversation this week that's on the podcast with Reverend Hannah made me rethink all of this, because this doesn't work with music at all, because that definition of sacred and secular is all about written texts. So in that sense, there's no such thing as sacred music, at least sacred instrumental music from Newhouse's definition. So I'm having to rethink this whole thing. Sarah messed me up. I was like, why are you doing this to me? I hate when they make me think.
I'm just sitting here thinking about, you talking about secular and sacred. Isn't it true that for as long as we have any evidence, people have worshipped something? Right? We go back to go back to Kentucky.
Yeah.
We worship something, and we have always felt that there was some power greater than us. Now, way back when, we used that to explain why sometimes lightning comes out of heaven.
Right.
Now we have more sophisticated explanations of that. But for most of human history, I think, we have not separated secular and sacred.
Yeah.
You didn't choose to be this religion, you didn't choose to be a Thor worshiper or something. You were because you were born where Thor was worshipped. And so we have this like almost built-in thing that we worship something and we need something higher than ourselves to explain things. Things that we've learned to explain a lot,
Right.
but not everything yet.
Yeah, and so the question is about have humans not always had an impulse to worship, an impulse for this? And I think that some, again, world historians would argue that, yeah, there's a time when there's no separation because all the world is seen as sacred, because all the world is seen as being governed by the gods or God or whatever, right? But certainly this changes with the Enlightenment, where it's like, okay, that we start understanding a lot of how the natural world works. Some in the Enlightenment thought that what's going to happen inevitably is that impulse to worship is going to disappear because we're going to explain everything, and we're not going to need God to explain anything. I think the Christian message is still that there is a kingdom coming in which God will reign. That God in Jesus is returning. He said it in the end of communion today. Right? That kingdom is coming, and until that moment, we are in the time being. We're in this other moment. Right? The question then becomes, what role do nations, what role do people groups play in that moment? So let me address this in the terms you were using. It's like, okay, I worship Odin or Thor because I was born in a culture that worships Odin and Thor, right? That is rooted in a kind of a sense of a nation being like a people group. Okay, there are some folks who have really wrestled with this with modern nations, and have tried to use the phrase nation state to distinguish modern nations from older understandings of nations. And I think this is very helpful for me as a Bible reader, because when I come to the Hebrew scripture and I get the nation of the Edomites and the nation of these are people groups, okay, where there is a strong identification between the people and an ethnicity or a race. Okay. Modern nation states, especially the United States, is not that. Okay. Now there may be some situations, even in the contemporary world, where if someone says, let's say, I'm Japanese, they may be saying something. If someone living in Japan says I'm Japanese, they're saying something about their citizenship and their ethnicity. But to say, I am an American, legally, in legal language, in our contemporary understanding of this language, is not to say anything about my race or ethnicity. Okay, that's where we are legally at the moment. Now, there have been times in our history when to say I am an American citizen, so if I clarify that, I'm an American citizen, there were times when I perhaps was saying something at least marginally about my race or ethnicity. Okay. 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act is passed by Congress that says we're not going to allow immigration from China. Yeah, and so there's a time when people born in Japan cannot own property. Okay. Their children can, but they cannot. Okay, so and of course the whole Jim Crow time in the history of the southern United States, where at least the full rights of a citizen do have something to do with your race and ethnicity, but legally those have dropped away. And to say I'm an American citizen is not necessarily saying anything about my race or ethnicity.
But what if you're a Native American?
Then you're not, this takes what, until the 1920s? Till the 1920s before indigenous people are granted citizenship, right? In part because part of that, we're a people of blessing, especially kind of as an Anglo-American kind of idea, means that we're going to spread across this land and indigenous people are simply going to disappear. They're going to dwindle away.
We're going to kill them off.
Yeah, they're going to, unless they intermarry and become part of the citizenry, they are simply going to disappear. And when this doesn't happen, then the government has to think, well, wait a minute, what are we going to do? And all these terribly repressive, but eventually they're offered citizenship. But that's not until the 1920s.
Well, if you accept the definition of America as not an ethnic group, but being an American is strictly an American thing, doesn't that make us weaker if we try and say America is a Christian nation? Because basically we're excluding a lot of people from that. In other words, nationalism may be a good thing in the sense that it unites a whole bunch of people with different ethnicities, and just pick out one and say this is the reason that we're Americans. Doesn't that weaken?
I think this is part of why this notion of a Christian America persists, is because it's so interesting to ask this of, as I've done, a classroom of 40 18 to 22-year-old American citizens. When I ask them, what does it mean to say I'm an American? And to watch them really wrestle with that question, right? I think it would be the case for Americans of any age. Like, what is it? There's one theorist who calls it an imagined community. That a modern nation state is an imagined community. We imagine that we have something in common.
Which we do.
Yeah,
Right.
and it becomes a construct. But how you define that construct may vary among the people in the
community, right? So we're an imagined community. I know. When traveling abroad, you meet. It's like, oh, you're an American. I'm an American. It's like, I'm from San Diego. You're from Bangor, Maine. Like, there's no possible reason that we would ever meet, and yet somehow it's like, oh, we're Americans. It's
The
like,
thing about nations is that people don't have to know each other or share ethnic identities or religious identities. And that's still a cohesive thing.
Yeah, are we bound together?
Yeah.
What is it that binds us together? Adherence to the Constitution? But if there's a lot of these things, like I think for some, it is however they define it, a Christian heritage. So the question then becomes, and Newhouse has an essay about this too, where he writes, can you be an atheist and a good American citizen? Right? It's like, well, what is that? To say yes means you have to rethink what are the ideas that are holding this together. Okay. And there have certainly been times, and you look at it in the history of immigration in this country, where people have said, we're in America, but this group can't blend. This group cannot blend. They don't believe enough. They can't be made democratic.
But that's like the melting pot idea, and then instead of a mosaic, where you would put together all these different.
Well, David, let me, if I follow up with that, like this again, if you go to the congressional record, there are times when people where senators and congressmen, and I think I can be gender exclusive at that point, said, for example, the Chinese are incapable of functioning in a democratic society. Therefore, we need to exclude them from a possibility of immigration. We're hearing it today with Muslims, which in my neighborhood is like, you're just telling me that what I'm looking at all around me is not real. Right? You're asking me to deny the reality of my community, of my neighborhood.
Excuse me, when you have a segment that wants others to adhere to Sharia law, then you have something in conflict with the U.S. Constitution.
Sure. Right. To find American Muslims who arguing for Sharia law is pretty rare.
Yes, that's very rare.
Apparently a lot in Oklahoma.
I have a very simple question. Define the word united.
We're out of time.
We have so many competing constructs. We have rugged individualism, we have melting pot, we have Christian, we have separation of church and state, competing mythologies.
And it seems like every time we try to limit, we're a Christian nation, we're a white nation, the only people of value are landowners. Anytime we do that, we fall away from these Christian ideals that we started with.
And I would argue as well that not only does this complicate our sense of the nation, but what does it do to our sense of the church? What does it do to our sense of the church as God's bride, as the bride of Christ? Like what we sang, if you go to the language of that hymn we sang this morning, that so elevates the church as the eternal institution, the institution that will survive all of the events of history because it is established by Jesus through the Apostle Peter. And it is this, that it is through the church that salvation comes. It's like, so we're talking about what it does to the nation. What does it do to the church? Is I think a really important question. But to come back to this, like this imagined community, like what is it that holds us together? Like what is it that unites us? Okay.
Well, I'm a naturalized citizen. Feeling a little shaky lately
About your choice.
about how safe my citizenship is. Well, it is not. I mean, I love my country, and this is my country. But I love what it aspires to be, more so than what it is. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, yeah.
Okay, well, those aspirational issues are primarily the things that were being written into the Constitution that were part of the Enlightenment. Kind of the big deal question then is how much, or how vaguely, the writers wanted to allow how much religion was going to be expressly included in those qualities that are written into multiculturalism or fill in the blank.
And one of the, Stan, one of the criticisms that the Confederacy, the founders, the writers of the Confederate Constitution, one of the criticisms they had of the U.S. Constitution is there's no mention of God in the U.S. Constitution. And so if you go to the Constitution of the Confederate United States, after they secede, there's God talk all the way through. Wrestle with that one. Wrestle with that one.
I never read the Confederate Constitution. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
It was all over it.
there's a lot more God language in the Confederate Constitution than in the U.S. Constitution, because there's none in the U.S. Constitution. One other, as a transition to next week, 1847, a editorial writer uses the term manifest destiny.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And it gets picked up as a national policy, that it is God's will that the United States, at that stage,
Go west, young man.
75 years, not even 75 years old, should have control of the nation coast to coast, of the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In other words, saying to France, to Spain, to Russia, hands off, God meant this for us. And so we'll wrestle with that moment next week, because you'll really see this when we get to the radical abolitionists who are calling for the end of slavery, where that Jeremiah kind of functions in their world. Like where that's like, what's the promise? Who are we to be as a people?